Apollo 1 Disaster by Ariana Donlick. The Apollo 1 was designed to be the first manned Apollo mission to get an American on the moon. However, instead it was NASA's first disaster. There were 3 astronauts planned to go on this mission: Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. Lieutenant Virgil Grissom, also known as Gus, was one of the original NASA Project Mercury astronauts. He was also a United States Air Force test pilot and a mechanical engineer. Edward Higgins White was an American aeronautical engineer, U.S. Air Force officer, test pilot, and a NASA astronaut. On June 3, 1965, he became the first American to walk in space. Lastly, Roger Bruce Chaffee was an American naval officer, a naval aviator, aeronautical engineer, and a NASA astronaut. Chaffee was also an Eagle Scout. On January 27, 1967, tragedy happened. During a pre-flight test, a fire started on the Apollo 1 and killed all 3 astronauts on board. With the heavy hatch door, dense smoke, and intense heat, it was impossible to save the men. Their conversation was recorded during the fire. Researching the accident, it is clear that communication was at a low. The fire could not have started on its own, meaning there was some type of mechanical malfunction. Realizing that, there may have been a blueprint or a wiring mix-up. To figure out exactly what caused the accident, more thorough research would need to be done. I will now play a recording of what happened during the fire. Cabin pressure rises, and White attempts to release hatch but increased cabin pressure. The last thing that was said was Chaffee saying, "We're burning up," and then the transmission shut off. To prevent the tragedy, engineers or anybody working on this aircraft could have triple-checked everything. The astronauts and the people in the hub could have had better communication while reporting back to each other. Instead, they would just ignore each other or report back in incomplete sentences. The design could have been better as well. They could have made the hatch door lighter and had it open the other way, which is going out instead of going in. And they could have had oxygen masks inside so the astronauts or anybody inside could breathe, in case a fire did pop up. Lastly, they could have had fire extinguishers inside of the aircraft, which would have saved them all on this tragic day in history. Many people try to rush through projects even if it can destroy reputations or lives. I would recommend that any aircraft should be checked 3 times, have correct engineering, and constant communication. With the aircrafts, there should be less combustible matter as possible, fire extinguishers on board, lighter hatch doors, and oxygen masks readily available so that we don't have this type of accident happening to our future astronauts again. I highly recommend you consider triple checking and having better communication the next time you try to do any project, big or small.